United States Olympic Committee, Training Design Symposium. 2008, Clive Brewer, Director of the UK Strength and Conditioning Association, Planning for Team Sports. Brewer is also the leader for the Sports Scotland National Development Programs and the National Strength and Conditioning Coach for Scottish athletes. Things we need to consider. What are we planning for? What emphasis are going to be put on planning at any given time? Loading, volume loading, or training load? What are you trying to focus on? In other words, if you focus on too many variables, you may not concentrate long enough on any of them. How do you manage the planning process? How does a week change with competition? How do you use measurements, tools, to look at any individual at any given time? These questions imply and suggest all athletes may be different and have different needs to meet individual goals within the team structure. Training principles. Overload. Volume load or frequency, duration of exercises, sets, and rep ranges. Intensity or mode, load, unload. Variation. Periodic and systematic training will stimulate recovery and adaptation, improve long-lasting enhancement or long-term potentiation, and prevent overtraining syndrome. How much variety is good and how variety is not good because the athletes are not learning or improving. Recovery adaptation. Time frame for recovery depends on magnitude of stress generated by training to each individual. That is, different individuals respond differently to same training stimulus. Because of this, coaches should know each individual's training status at any given time. Coaches can monitor and evaluate team and individuals to find out training status. Classic periodization model. Manipulate volume and intensity in order to peak for targeted competition. What we understand is that all periodization is non-linear and not chaotic, but is organized, planned, and structured. That is, coaches will work on certain things at certain times to get or achieve specific goals of training. Why is it we are doing something? Training plan must be evidentially based. This can be accomplished by viewing and learning strategies from experts or sports scientists. Lectures like this one, reading peer-reviewed publications that emphasize the same variables you are working on. Many times, the principles from sports science and experts can be adapted to your particular team or sport. Training load equals volume times intensity. And because some exercises are more demanding than others, which ones do we use? Why and for how long? An answer might be to evaluate prior seasons, goals, plans, and outcomes. Then change emphasis on variables to target succession of athletic outcomes. Annual plans for teams. Annual plans for team sports emphasis should be on volume and intensity of training because most team sports competition seasons are predetermined by coaches and athletic directors. Annual plans for individual on team sports. Typically, the preseason and postseason are times when individual annual plans are best suited because of predetermined seasons. Training age means how athletic and experienced individuals are in sport, and training age can be increased with individual annual plans. Team sports training load. With weekly performance schedule, training volume must change. Need to make sure players are relatively fresh for matches every week or microcycle. Priorities can be placed on certain games based on record because there are too many games. Most players overplay and undertrain. Thus, training volumes must be reduced because there are too many games. Training load, not intensity, will determine whether a week is characterized as very heavy, heavy, medium heavy, or medium high. High volume or low intensity, or rather high volume equals low intensity and vice versa. Challenge: reducing volume in training may decrease overall fitness if reduced consistently. Fitness fatigue paradigm. The key problem deals with maximum fitness and minimum fatigue to be prepared for any given competition. In other words, athletes can become fatigued over a month or so with reduced training and mini games. How do we determine intensity? You can look at time as a percentage of maximal training intensity, perceived efforts, heart rates achieved, demands on plyometrics selected, that is depth jumps versus jumping onto something, loading being lifted, and weight room exercises selected, that is curl versus snatch. Rugby example: pushing scrum for one person sled, 3-person sled, or full team pushing scrum. Each scrum becomes exponentially more intense due to more mass pushing. Oversimplification of training load integration example. Week 1, heavy strength and conditioning plus medium sport equals medium heavy load. Week 2, medium strength and conditioning plus very heavy sport equals heavy load. Week 3, very heavy strength and conditioning plus heavy sport equals very heavy load. Week 4, light strength and conditioning plus light sport equals light load, recovery week. Challenge: most team sports and individual sports do not have a 4-week block of training during the competition season. Most professional team sports schedules seasonal. Example: 3 to 4 week transition, which should be active recovery away from sport-specific stress. 8 to 11 weeks of prep, which includes preseason competitions. 37 to 41 weeks of competition, and athletes can play hurt versus injured for a short time, but cannot play under or are underprepared. In basketball, baseball, soccer, rugby, hockey, there are usually more than one game per week, so coaches have to get creative with resting and developing players. Challenge: resting developing players may disrupt team chemistry, cohesiveness, and strategy. Considerations: high performance, consistency to peak or not to peak. That is the question. What's the competitive outcome? Club coach versus national coach, or club coach versus high school coach. Both may have different training designs. So I'm just going to stop and kind of review some of the material that we've gone over so far. Essentially, this is another strength and conditioning coach giving you the basics of strength and conditioning. We've had so far about 3 different outcomes and or audio notes for strength and conditioning. By the way, this original lecture was about an hour and 50 minutes, and these are the audio notes. What I want to point out, though, is because we have so many different types of strength and conditioning discussions, you should have a very good overall basic knowledge of the periodization paradigm and or models. The other thing I just want to point out lastly, because we just talked about it, was the length of time that many professional sports have to prepare and or train, and then their actual seasons. The last sort of statement there suggested that their season is so long, and many times professional sports have so many competitions per week, it becomes very difficult for them to get rest and recovery because they've got so many competitions over the course of 37 to 41 weeks of competition. I'm going to make an analogy with youth sport, high school sport, and collegiate sport, in as much as I believe that this day and age, most youth sport, high school sport, and collegiate sport is using a professional model. In other words, we're having seasons that are lasting 37 to 41 weeks as well, and as coaches, we've got to become very creative so we don't burn athletes out, athletes reduce the risk of injury, and we continue to, basically attract athletes into our sport. I guess the last point I want to make on that sort of note is that if you pay attention to professional sports, there are a lot of coaches that actually will rest their players. I don't watch a lot, but I pay attention to news talk radio with regard to sport, and every now and then I'll hear how coaches will sit their best players so that they can get a rest, especially as they get older. I watch a lot of soccer currently right now, and that happens frequently in soccer. It happens actually in NBA and in baseball and most professional sports. The coaches have figured out we're playing too many games. It's not possible for my athletes to play all of the games and be ready for the playoffs and or the championship. So I just throw that in there because we can learn something from the professional sports. If their professional sports are resting their athletes, that should be a clue that we may actually want to do the same thing. And then the last thing before we continue these audio notes is we are not professionals at youth and high school and college, so we may need to rethink the whole paradigm in terms of how many competitions we're having. Succession planning, that is, players have team and need to be replaced. Facility considerations for travel and training. That is, accommodations need to fit team. Demands of sport per individual needs and travel. Travel is fatiguing. 5 rings model from Scotland, coach's education program. At any moment in athlete's development and progression, require one of these 5 rings from the coach. Number 1, technique and tactical training. Number 2, physiological training. Number 3, lifestyle training. Number 4, physical fitness factors. And number 5, movement skills training. Each athlete may need different amounts of 5 rings during and throughout career. I'm going to stop right there because that's really, I think, important. Not only are we teaching the athletes how to be good athletes, but we're also teaching them how to manage their lifestyles and develop their psychological skills, which is going to help them in all other parts of their life. And each individual athlete may need different amounts of the 5 rings during and throughout their career, because some athletes may mature quicker, some athletes may actually get hurt, some athletes may have other issues going on. So we're always going to need to focus on the individual needs of each individual athlete, meet them where they are, then coach and develop them where they're standing at that moment. Grouping a performance model by Howie Wenger from Canada. For training and peak performance, it's like a gearbox and an engine. There are a number of different cogs that drive training. Peak and performance, and each one of these bigger cogs have a number of smaller cogs. As an example, the physical component must be supported by the nutritional component, the health state of the athlete, and fitness of athlete. And fitness will have a number of cogs around it too. Coaches must make sure that all of the cogs are turning in the same direction and speed as all of the other cogs. And coach must make sure individual on team fits with each other as well. Brewer's gearbox model. This idea and adapted it for a player-centered, coach-driven model. Lead coaches surrounded by other coaches, specialists, managers, and sports science team. That is, trainer, strength and conditioning coach, doctor, nutritionist, and sports psychologist. Each one of these people need to be the right people, qualified, certified, and accredited, plus communicating with each other to make sure all of the gears are working properly and correctly in order to attain high performance training and competitions for athlete. Why integrated support works. Collective minds have greater potential perspective than individual expertise. When coherence exists, less likely that critical elements will be overlooked. This all leads to efficiency and delivery of support for athlete. Awareness of total demands of the player. Demands are games, training, travel, sponsors, commercial opportunities, work and school. Those factors take the resources of time and energy away from athletes. So, coaches must apply a holistic approach to system development. Coaches must monitor over a longer term and track position, positive and negative outcomes of above demands. Coaches will get things right sometimes and have to be smart enough to know when they've gotten it wrong. Pathway to performance model. Coach-driven, athlete-centered program goals. Coach and specialist coach relationship that are on the same page with the training philosophy, and that is evidential-based. Periodized planning. Player support from specialists in communication to coach. Motivation. Physical training volume and load, and training intensity that considers other training demands and pays attention to detail by adding recovery for full adaptation and monitoring the nutrition, hydration, sleep, etc. So I'm going to just kind of take another break here and review some of the things that were discussed with regard to performance enhancement training or performance enhancement teams. The idea behind that is to have several people working together that have actually different tasks. Now, this would be hard unless you're at an Olympic training center where they have a lot of funding, where you can have a psychologist, a strength and conditioning coach, a sports-specific coach, a nutritionist, etc. On a high school team and or a club team, the coach has to take the onus on learning a lot of that information, and this is really the crux why I'm putting this this type of information out there for coaches to actually learn, because more times than not, we're not going to have the funding of an Olympic training center, but we can learn the basics of many of the disciplines of a strength and conditioning coach or a sports psychologist, definitely of the sport-specific coach, because that's what we're doing. We're wrestling coaches by nature, but we also need to learn parts of those other skill sets so that we can certainly give our athletes the basics, so when if they have aspirations of going into high school, college, and beyond, they at least understand the basic mechanics of sports psychology, sports nutrition, sports-specific movement, strength and conditioning, etc. Player development program from Scottish Rugby Union. Example, fundamental stage leads into learning to play, leads to developing the player, leads to learning to compete, leads to training to compete, and finally training to win. This process takes about 10 years to accomplish. The expectation is for all players to go through these stages via the 5 rings and all coaches to deliver. So that's a long-term athlete development program. Recently, as of, last year or this year, the United States Olympic Training Center put together a long-term athlete development plan that we will soon be using with the Elias George Wrestling Foundation. On another note, I learned all of this stuff back in 2007 and 2008, and these are audio notes from those actual times. So when I learned all of this stuff, I actually applied it to my teams almost immediately, and I saw very good results and outcomes. So these are some of the things that I want to bring to coaching, and my addition to the coaching world is to bring it down several levels so that high school coaches and club coaches all have access to the information to develop high-performance training and high-performance athletes. Player profiling describes profile of athletes and technical and tactical, physical development, physical literacy, psychological, and lifestyle management abilities, which is better than just profiling by age. In other words, there are so many dimensions to why athletes have better performance than others. It's not just because of age, and it's not just because they've been in sport for a long period of time. There are all of those characteristics that I just listed have an effect on athletes' development. So once we find out where they are in terms of measuring the level of each one, we can increase the level of each one, and that actually is going to create a better athlete. Sports-specific training. Performance outcome are the result of complex multi-muscle, multi-joint movements, where muscles produce efficient movement, maximal multi-planar forces in required time frame, and a stable structure to support that movement. Critical physical performance variables. For rugby and power and ability to repeat power outputs, anaerobic lactate system, endurance and multi-directional speed with emphasis on no loss of acceleration. That's a rugby example, but that could be used for any type of sport that uses power and ability as a big part of their sport. Force velocity curve. Maximal strength influences speed proportionately. So if athlete gets stronger, athlete can produce more force, and athlete's velocity will increase. That becomes important for sport-specific movements, and the idea there is if you get stronger in sport-specific movements through strength and conditioning or tactical and technical training, you actually can do the move more efficiently and effectively. And strength and conditioning can add to that in regard to the strength and conditioning coach and or coach putting together the right training design so we're strengthening the right muscles. The annual structure. Stimulate desired adaptation to optimize performance. Determine critical performance variables as focus of training. Ensure recovery training to minimize fatigue. Produce performances at required times and determine appropriate number of performances. Follow GAS or General Adaptation Syndrome principles, that is train, recover, supercompensate, which includes manipulating volumes and intensities per meso and microcycles. Appropriate number of matches must be determined prior to season to induce peak performances and reduce overtraining. So I'm going to review some of that material again because the general adaptation syndrome was by Selye, and the idea behind it is there are 3 or 4 different components to stress and you being able to peak: training, recovery, supercompensation, and then you can continue that cycle over and over again. On the other hand, if there is no recovery and supercompensation, and if you just train, you're more likely to overtrain. What is also a part of that same, those principles are the number of matches that you have. If you have too many matches, meaning you don't have enough time to recover and regenerate in between matches, you will not peak at a certain point. At a certain point, you will become flat, and all of your matches will be very similar to an overtrained state, which means you may not have high performance training during training, and you will not have high performance competitions because you'll be flat. Integration, hybridization, movement mechanics in warm-ups and alignment drills. Also, agility and speed strength work can be done in warm-ups. Other equipment can be used. Example: sandbags, throwing dummies, ropes, cones during practice and training. Team building. At every opportunity, because it enables variation to training, which breaks up routine and, more importantly, develops trust, communication, decision-making, and adaptation. Integrating recovery. Examples: ice baths every session, organized pool sessions, unorganized pool sessions, massages. Just want to recover those team building and integrating recovery examples. I started using all this stuff in about 2007, 2008 on an ongoing basis. About 2005, 2006, I began the study of all of these different principles. Team building is essential in terms of developing a program. Each individual has to trust one another, and then they actually can work better as a team. Even if you're in an individual sport like wrestling, where there's only one person out there training at a time or competing at a time, when you're training, though, you actually need 6 or 7 other people to train with, and that's when the team building can become extremely important. Integrating recovery examples would be you can actually recover with your team, and that actually can be team building and team bonding as well. Age group national programs. Macro or annual plans must factor in preparation plus selection and academic stressor phases. Fitness standards, tracking progress for strength, power, and conditioning per exercise and age groups. You can create a profile for anything, and monitoring these profiles tracks growth and development. Fitness profiles and diagrams or pictures can be used for athletes to increase motivation to change. Tracking should be done all year to demands of training and competitions. A lot of wrestlers track their weights throughout the weeks and months of season. Forms like ResQ, Training Log, and Recovery Q can also be used to measure athletes' readiness to train and compete. As a side note, there are some, videos that I put on the public side that illustrate the training logs, ResQ, and Recovery Q. There are also articles in the coach's corner that you can read, and there's likely going to be more information in the audio notes on ResQ, Training Log, and Recovery Q. Those are all monitoring tools that if we learn as coaches enough about, we can implement, execute those type of things for our athletes, and they can in turn start to monitor themselves. Monitoring training state examples: hydration status, heart rate data, and receive or RPE stands for rate of perceived exertion. Competitions can be prioritized as green, yellow, red. That is, higher priorities in importance to enhance and assist training and focus goals. Training should mirror competitions. That is, if competitions are in afternoon, night, main training should be in afternoon, morning, or night. Training loads should change and vary based on pre-competition, competition, transition, and preseason phases. That is, lower volumes during competitions and higher volumes during other, and much lower during transition. That's a good point too. Just to reiterate it again, I mean, these whole talks, or the whole design, is to basically enhance our athletes and give them the best opportunity for success. And just that last point again, the different phases of an annual plan are going to have different volumes of training. In other words, if you're training your athletes the same volume the whole year, A, there's no variety. B, they're probably going to burn out. And C, we're doing our athletes a disservice. Training schedule day. Day of and before competition. Training schedule form can be created to help athletes focus, relax, and prepare for competition. Energy continuum. Most team sports are anaerobically focused. Ice hockey, basketball, soccer, rugby, football are all at least 65% aerobic. Aerobic benefits. Several interval 100-yard sprints will increase aerobic pace because the athlete will be breathing fast and heavy. When breathing heavy and fast, the O2 that is being replenished, and during that time, athlete is getting an aerobic conditioning benefit. Create tests for strength and conditioning sport to help develop standards for sport and individual athletes. I'm going to back up just a little bit and go over the anaerobic benefits again. I'm a proponent of, making your sport and training very similar. And I've said this on some other audio notes with regard to running more than a mile for the most part, and or how you would run the mile, right? So as a runner, the runners have distances from 50 yards all the way up to, at the Olympic level, a marathon, which is 26.2 miles. Now, as wrestlers, we may not ever need to run more than 2 to 3 miles because our competition is at max going to be 7 minutes in college, 6 minutes internationally, and 6 minutes in high school, and even 5 and 4 and down to 3 as you go down the age group levels. So my point there is, if our matches are 6 minutes, do we really need to be running longer than a mile? Probably not, in my opinion. And I've had success with that. I stopped running at the Olympic Training Center because of that, at least when I was a coach. On the other hand, we could run up to a mile because a mile is typically about 6 or 7 minutes. But how you run the mile, I think, is important too, because our sport is a bunch of explosive movements, back to back to back to back. In other words, a 15-second go times however many you can get to be 6 minutes. That's the way that we would want to train. Or a 100-meter dash or 100-yard dash over and over and over again up to 6 minutes. So depending on how you run the mile, I think is important, and how we're training our athletes to be explosive, I think is also important. A coached session example. This suggests athletes training less while being instructed and coached. A coach session can actually reduce fitness if coaches are not careful. Conclusion. There are so many things involved with planning so that a detailed debate with experts is needed. That is, create a performance enhancement team of specialists and integrate coaching, strength and conditioning, sports medicine, and sports psychology. Those would be examples of a performance enhancement team. Plan for volume and intensity considerations within and between all aspects of training competitions. Focuses on the individual within the team can be executed by monitoring forms and evaluation forms, and by effective communication. How many competitions can one person effectively compete in? What is the training to competitions ratio? Brewer believes many athletes train too little and compete too much. How do you get the best out of a training week and reduce fatigue or injuries consistently? In conclusion, questions can be successfully and effectively answered. Or, if conclusion questions can be successfully and effectively answered, athlete and team will be motivated, ready, willing, and able. And again, I just want to reiterate that these audio notes are provided for the coaches so that the coaches can become equipped, better educated, and learn more about training design to ultimately enhance the performance of our athletes in training and in competition.